This is Dan Schneider. This is American TV with Mitchell Hadley, and our show this week, this month actually, we're going to be focused on 10 of the most significant moments in American television history, and going to try to do it maybe a little bit different than your typical top 10 list. This isn't necessarily that some war coverage was more important than 9/11, or this show's best episode was more significant than something else, but just Mitch had this idea of significant rather than necessarily best, and so we're just going to go through, and I'll comment and he'll comment, and maybe we'll come up with a few others after we get to 10. But Mitch, welcome. For the people who don't know you, can you just give a little background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am a classic era TV specialist, which I write about every week at the website itsabouttv.com. I've written 3 books, including a book of essays on television called The Electronic Mirror, and I'm going to have a new book coming out late this summer. Its new title is Darkness in Prime Time, and it's going to be a look at how the classic era shows of the 50s and 60s foresaw the world that we live in today, not necessarily for the positive. So that's what I've been working on, and that's where we are right now.
Well, once you get the book done, we'll have to do a show or two on some of your best theses. But now we're going to deal with significance. So just for the record, how would you define significant rather than best or greatest or whatever?
Well, what I did when I sat down to make this list, and I just kind of had a fun time doing it, and I tried to pick out 10 shows or 10 moments, because they're not all shows, 10 moments that were significant in that they were the harbinger of things to come, or they were their first of its kind, or they set a trend for future events on television, future programs, future formats. And I suppose the best way to illustrate that is just to jump right in with the first one. And I'm going in chronological order, okay. But it probably, to nobody's surprise, it would be the birth of little Ricky on I Love Lucy. And this is January 19th, 1953. And the reason I chose this, although I'm not particularly an I Love Lucy fan, but the reason I chose it was because it sums up so many things about television. The idea that a special event such as a wedding or a birth can create this huge wave of popularity and turn it into a must-see program. The idea that you had a show that could galvanize an enormous number of people, and when the Ricky show was broadcast, it had 73.9% of all American homes tuned in to the show, all the homes that had TV. So that amounted to about 44 million viewers. It was not only the largest audience in the history of television to that point, but you'll notice I mentioned the date, January 19th, 1953. The next day was the inauguration of Dwight D. Eisenhower as president. This got a bigger audience than that. So this was truly an event. And as far as the percentage of homes that were tuned in, that wasn't broken until Elvis's first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show, when you got up to about 83% of the public. So the reason I selected this show for its significance was because it was probably the first example of an episode of weekly television that was must-see, that people had to tune in, wanted to tune in, that there was this tremendous anticipation for it. People knew that it was coming up. It wasn't necessarily suspense. It just happened that Lucy gave birth in real life on the same day. But it was a widely anticipated event that became kind of a communal occasion for the entire country. And I think we've seen so many things in television like that since then, but this was the very first time it happened.
Yeah, that would be event television with TV in the role of nascent art form, I guess. If
Mhm.
I were to look at something from that era, I would go to something that we've talked about before, so we don't have to spend that much time on. I
Sure.
would go with the Army McCarthy hearings.
That was my next one, so I agree with you completely on that.
And this, as we've said before, this was a precursor to Watergate, to Iran-Contra, to C-SPAN's formation, to making, I guess you would call it, sport of politics. Before then,
Hmm.
it was sort of an arcane thing that the only time you ever thought about it was in a Jimmy Stewart movie when he went to Washington or something.
Yeah.
Whereas Army McCarthy sort of creaked open the doors and let the public in.
Yeah, if there's anybody who's not familiar with that, what that was a congressional investigation involving Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was part of the communist, the Red Hunt at the time, and it was an investigation into communist infiltration of the U.S. Army. So that's where it got its name from, and it ran from April through June of 1954. The reason that it became as significant as it did is because it was covered live on two television networks, ABC and Dumont, and it perhaps saved ABC as a network. Neither of these networks had any substantial daytime programming to speak of, unlike NBC and CBS. So for each one of them, it was a natural to just preempt an entire day's lineup that wasn't that important to begin with, and to cover something that began to become increasingly important and increasingly public as it went along. You had Edward R. Murrow getting involved. You had everybody choosing sides. As you say, it was tremendous theater, and what it did was demonstrate the ability of television to cover and to influence politics. As you mentioned, we've seen many other examples of that: Watergate, Iran-Contra, all sorts of other scandals and other news events that came afterward. But this was the first time television showed that it could be a player in something like this. I want to differentiate that from being the first time it proved it could cover a breaking news event. That's not the same thing, and we'll get to that. But this was the first time people really became aware of the power of television to become involved in politics, to determine how we were going to view the people involved in it, to give widespread coverage to what was going on, and to really influence the way people looked at things. McCarthy was riding very high before that. He was a controversial figure, but still had a lot of national popularity. And he was never able to recover from the twin blows that came from this series of broadcasts and then Murrow's program on him. Between those two things, and one directly leads to the other, McCarthy was never able to recover. His popularity continued to go down. He was eventually censured by the Senate the next year and dies in office. So it's a very sad ending, but it shows just how important TV was becoming, how it was riding on the back of the I Love Lucy phenomenon to be the kind of thing that people really felt was important to tune into for more than just entertainment.
So you said this was your number two thing, right?
Yes.
So let
Hmm.
me let me give then a counter number two. I think maybe we can do it that way.
Sure.
And I think maybe if we go to 1960, it's the debate between JFK and Nixon, because
Hmm.
there, presumably, a lot of people say this was the power of the image, because
Yes.
people who listened on radio said that Nixon seemed to get the better of JFK, but those who only saw the video on television, JFK came out looking more presidential, and this was the precursor of the if of sort of, I guess, style over substance. Whereas
Hmm.
Nixon looked sweaty, his eyes were sunken. He looked like he was hiding something. Whereas
Yeah, and
JFK
he had
was,
been ill
yeah.
beforehand, and that showed awfully on TV.
Yeah, so that to me that is a very TV specific thing.
I would agree with you there. I don't have it on my list for this simple reason that I would kind of consider that a 2A, that
Okay.
that although the debates may have been more important to history in the long run, that the hearings set the stage for the debates. But I don't disagree at all with your inclusion of them in a list, because without those debates, you don't have the debates that you have on TV now, which are more or less taken for granted that they're going to exist.
And so let's move on then to your third.
The third event that I have on my list is the assassination of Kennedy in 1963. And while you could look at this as an offshoot of Army McCarthy and the debates, the reason I chose it as a standalone item was because whereas the Army McCarthy hearings proved that television could be a significant influencer in politics, this was the event that once and for all demonstrated that television was going to become the dominant form of news gathering for the majority of people. You had up till that time, radio, I think radio and the newspaper were the significant news gathering sources. Television was coming along. It was perhaps even the equal of radio in some ways. But if people wanted to know what was happening, if they wanted to know the opinions, if they wanted to know the outcomes, the possible next steps in the development of a story, they'd go to their newspapers, whether it was the Times or the Chicago Tribune or any other local paper that they would have access to. The men who wrote for those papers were popular, well known, authoritative, and respected. But the assassination of John F. Kennedy was an event that was happening too quickly for the papers to adequately be able to cover. They did a very good job covering it, but they kept issuing extras throughout the day and throughout the weekend, but they weren't ultimately able to compete with television's ability to show things as it happened, not just as it happened in the sense of Oswald's murder and then the Kennedy funeral, but as it happened in the sense that the story kept evolving hour after hour, day after day. All of those were being captured live on television. If you were dependent on the paper, you wouldn't be finding out about that until the afternoon, until the evening if you bought an extra, or until the next morning conceivably. So this is where television begins to assert itself as the primary news gathering and news viewing media in the country. And what you'll notice as the coverage continues is that television reporters begin to get the advantage over newspaper and radio reporters. They are more prominent in the coverage. They are seated up closer to what's going on. You find that even well-known columnists and newspaper reporters are appearing on TV with their descriptions and assessment of what's going on. So it's the beginning of the end, I think, for the printed media as being the dominated news form, and the beginning of the moving picture of television as the authoritative one main source for gathering news. Now, of course, that's changed because online is even faster than that. But you can see that evolution, and that's why I think that the Kennedy assassination is separate from Army McCarthy. They do follow one after the other, but television gets its undisputed news credential from the assassination of Kennedy.
Well, I would go then, just to keep this sort of like a chain letter. I think the third inevitable thing that follows from that is when a man we've talked about before, Walter Cronkite, who was famously in the JFK assassination, taking off his glasses, when he turns against Vietnam a few years later.
Yes.
And I would rank that again simply because it's more TV specific, and I can't imagine that the owner of the New York Times or the Washington Post, I can't imagine any radio personality, I can't imagine any Hollywood personality coming out and saying that basically this is a waste of time and people are going to die unnecessarily. But I think because Cronkite at that point was the dominant, at least respect-wise, if not ratings-wise. He was the person, that I think he was the most trusted man in America. Voted back around that time. His coming out, famously, whether it's apocryphal or not, LBJ, supposedly thought, well, there goes the war. We just lost it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think that that's completely valid, and I think that when you talk about anybody else but Cronkite being able to accomplish that, the only non-television personality I can think of who might have even come close would have been Winchell. Back in Walter Winchell's heyday as a columnist and a radio personality, if he had come out against a war or if he had come out against a president, that would have gotten a lot of attention. It might not have been as roundly accepted because Winchell was so incredibly controversial, and you either loved him or you hated him. So Winchell is an imprecise comparison, but he's probably the only available comparison, and I think that would serve to bolster what you're talking about, that nothing could compare to what Cronkite was doing.
So what's next on your list?
Okay, next we go up to 1967, August 29th, and the final episode of The Fugitive. And this established for me, the reason it's significant is because it established the idea of a final episode to a series. Now, it wasn't the first time that there had been a final episode to a long-running TV series. Although a lot of people aren't aware of it, actually, Leave It to Beaver and Route 66 both had series-ending episodes, but they weren't particularly special. They just kind of led up to the end of the line. The series was over. This wrapped everything up nice and neat, but nobody took notice of them as being particularly out of the ordinary. The Fugitive was different for a couple of reasons. One, because it had taken 4 years to build up. And even though The Fugitive was not a serial program in the sense that the story continued from week to week, a single story, it was in that it was a premise that continued throughout the 4 years. The innocent man being escaping from prison, searching for justice, and in turn being hunted down by the police. It's a wonderful, irresistible storyline, and for 4 years this was a tremendously popular program. Now, ABC had no intention of having a final episode, and neither did Quinn Martin, for that matter, the producer. They all felt that it would hurt the syndication value of The Fugitive if the series was wrapped up, because people would be less likely to want to watch it again. But I would say cooler head sensibility prevailed. Martin came to understand that the public demanded a final episode, a resolution to something that they had become so invested in. And so when that final episode ran, and here's the other interesting thing about it, it did not run at the end of the regular season, which would be April, May, normally when a season goes into reruns. Rather than ending the regular season, this finale was held back until the very end of the summer reruns, which would continue to generate the suspense for the entire series. And it was the two-part story. It was the final 2 episodes of The Fugitive on network television. And that final episode, almost 46% of American households tuned in. It had a 72% share and nearly 26 million viewers. That was, 26 million households, more than 78 million viewers. It was, for some time after that, the single most watched show in television history. The reason I included this, besides my fondness for The Fugitive and for that episode, is because now we take it as a given that any series, even ones that only run 1 or 2 years, any series is going to get a send-off unless it's abruptly canceled. But that wasn't the case back then. And if The Fugitive had not garnered such an enormous audience, Would we have the final episode of MASH? Would we have the final episode of Dallas, of Seinfeld, of Friends, of any of these long-running shows, Breaking Bad to bring it into the modern era, Better Call Saul? Would we have any of these series-ending episodes if not for The Fugitive? Maybe, maybe not. But The Fugitive is significant once again because it was the first. And until MASH came along with its final episode, that was the gold standard for the number of people watching. You would see lists in books and in newspapers of the most watched shows in TV history. It's always current. You're always talking about Super Bowls or Red Skelton or any number of series through the time. But as time progressed, and you started to see shows from the early 70s, the late 70s, even starting into the 80s, you would always have this one outlier up at number one from 1967. And even after it isn't the most watched show, it remains one of the most watched shows for a long time, and it always stands out for that reason. It's always at least 20 or 30 years older than its competition, and I think that's a real testimonial to the impact that it made on the viewers. It wasn't a great episode, but people wanted to know. It just galvanized the country, and I think that was a first of its kind.
Well, I'm going to take from something that you ended your recommendation with and argue against it in a way and
Sure.
give something else. You mentioned all these shows, some rather minor shows, some not so good shows that all get that send off, and I don't know if that's a good thing. Also, when you talk about The Fugitive and you talk about MASH, both of those shows were arguably great shows for their bulk. They had clunkers in between, but I think they also the endings themselves were, as you said, not the best shows. MASH was bloated to 90 minutes. I mean, it had some good things. The thing with Charles and the musicians that get killed, that was one of the more genuine moments in that. But I don't think people now, and I think this is a thing that would have been a better argument 40 or 50 years ago, but now, does anyone really think back with fondness to the last episode of The Fugitive or MASH? But I think that if you rent DVDs or if you stream, people still look at the ending of The Prisoner and go, whoa, my mind is blown. So I think if we're going to go for ending, I think The Prisoner, with only 17 episodes, its weakest 2 or 3 episodes are still excellent. And the ending is so deep and psychological. So I'm going to argue that more people now and in 50 years will still be looking back a century after it aired at the 1967-68 ending of The Prisoner than either MASH or The Fugitive. So I would nominate that for its artistic quality rather than having big ratings. Well, it did have big ratings in Britain, but here in the U.S. it was smaller. But I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, and I would not disagree with that. I chose The Fugitive purely on the basis of its significance in that what it augured for the future, what it introduced, how it changed television. But I think if you want to discuss quality particularly, which is very important, I think that The Prisoner was incomparable. And the people got into fights over the final episode of The Prisoner about its meaning. McGowan had to go into hiding afterwards for a while because it was so controversial. I'm not going to say any more about that in case there are people who haven't seen it who want to, but it's difficult to describe how influential that was and how excited people who did watch it worldwide got over it. And I think you hit on another point too about artistic quality, that if you look at the more recent shows that have gotten final episodes, whether it's Mad Men or Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul or yada yada yada, you can go down to The Sopranos, How I Met Your Mother. They've been incredibly controversial. People have seldom loved them, frequently hated them, occasionally didn't understand them, and were often disappointed by them. So they very rarely ever live up to their billing. I think that the prisoner did in that it was enigmatic. The fugitive did in that it answered the question. It gave people what they wanted, which was not an artistic success, but a resolution to the series. But I think that the trend nowadays is, as I said, people get angry about them. They get caught up in them, and they feel let down. And maybe that's a subject for another day, about how the relationship between viewers and the shows that they love to watch or love to hate has progressed. But I think that is a major difference from how we used to watch it.
Yeah, and another show that comes to mind as a great disappointment for even its fans was the end of Seinfeld.
Yes, yes, I think you're right there too. That you know, if you want to epitomize Eliot's line about the world ending with not with a bang but a whimper, that I think that is an adequate summation of that.
We're up or down to number five. So what's next on your list?
Number five is November 17th, 1968. The New York Jets versus the Oakland Raiders. Nobody remembers it by that name. It's the Heidi game, the Heidi Bowl. And for anybody who has never heard of this, what happened was that with less than 2 minutes to play in what had been a very exciting but very long game that was running well over its normal running time, New York Jets were leading the Oakland Raiders. I think it was 32-29. And the Raiders had the ball. A comedy of errors ensued in which NBC left the game to go to the children's movie Heidi, tried to get back to the game, were unable to get back to the game, stuck with Heidi, and therefore missed two touchdowns that the Raiders scored within a span of 5 seconds in the last minute and a half to give the Raiders a 43-32 victory. It blew up the switchboard at NBC. It outraged people. They compounded the mistake by running the score on the bottom of the screen during one of the climactic moments of Heidi, when a crippled girl gets up to take her first steps, and those steps are blocked by the NBC Sports bulletin on the bottom of the screen showing the final score. If that was all there was to it, it wouldn't have made my list unless we were talking about 10 hilarious sports moments. But what the Heidi game did was twofold. One, it didn't happen to the established NFL. It happened to the upstart AFL. At that point in time, the AFL had lost the first two Super Bowls. They were still known as the Junior League. They were struggling for credibility. And all of a sudden, a regular season AFL game between two of the best teams in the league blows up the switchboards with people complaining about it. This could only happen in a situation where you had a game that had galvanized the public. It showed the public, or it showed the experts, how invested the public was in this game. It showed football people that the AFL was a credible league, and that would be confirmed in a couple of months when the Super Bowl and Joe Namath and the Jets won. And it demonstrated, I think, for the first time, just how powerful sports had become to television. Up until that point, television kind of covered sports like it covered other live events. It was an event. It was out there. They broadcast it. That was it. But this is the start of a change where they see how important television is. They how important sports is to television, and that you can't mess around with it like that. There's a sizable audience that is going to throw a fit if you do that. So from that point on, television did not cut away from games unless they were completely settled. They would simply either preempt a program or they would bump the schedule to end later in the night. But this was really the moment when everyone understood how big a deal sports was on television. And you see in subsequent decades, I mean, 99 of the 100 top ranked shows every year are pro football games. All of the top rated shows in history are Super Bowls. Does that happen without the Heidi game? Again, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But the first inkling any of us had about just how important and how powerful sports was becoming was through this game.
We're really loading up on the 60s. And I
Yes,
think I know what's going to be your next one, but I'm going to go sort of offbeat here. And I mentioned Jimmy Stewart. I'm going to say Mr. Rogers Goes to Washington. And when Mr. Rogers went and spoke at a hearing for funding of public television, because it had only been around for a year or two, it was to be on the chopping block. And Fred Rogers, who we've mentioned before, went and made an impassioned plea for children's television, its need. And if he hadn't done that, I think the next 30 or 40 years of not public television, because they would have been gone, but for-profit corporate television, you wouldn't have had things like, well, the obvious PBS ones, the Sesame Streets, the electric companies, that kind of thing. You wouldn't have had Schoolhouse Rock on ABC. I don't think you would have had shows like Zoom. I don't think you would have had even non-PBS shows like The Big Blue Marble. I don't think you would have had things, even going as far as Beyond Our Borders. I think shows like the Degrassi shows from Canada, which showed young people, kids learning and dealing with things, would have been gone. And I think that's, even though it wasn't a huge ratings draw, the very fact that Fred Rogers went to Washington and got, I think it was a meager 10 million or something. I think that's a very important moment, even though it's not, obviously on the level in terms of eyes.
I would agree. Yes, I think that is a very significant moment in television.
So
And so I think you're absolutely right about that as a significant moment for the future of television. And I don't think it gets as much attention as it probably should.
So what's your number 6 then?
Well, number 6 on the list, I'm kind of skipping ahead here. For example, I looked at events like the moon landing, but really, I don't think that the moon landing. I think the moon landing really falls under the coverage of breaking news, which I think you get with the story of Kennedy's assassination. So I've skipped ahead to 1972 and the Munich Olympic massacre. And the reason I chose that was not so much for the fact that it is a news story, but this again, and I'm always looking at this in terms of beginnings. What do we see as a first, or something that colors how we see things in the future? And the Munich Olympic massacre was the first example of politics and news interjecting itself into sports in such a way that it became a news story itself. It wasn't the first intersection of politics and sports, because you had the famous protests at the Summer Olympics in 1968, the Black Power protests that some of the American athletes did, and that was very significant in and of itself. And I think that we've talked briefly about this when we talked about Howard Cosell, about his role in that and how it brought him to a certain level of prominence. But I think that the way that ABC Sports covered a breaking news story, the way Jim McKay acted as an anchorman, and Peter Jennings himself, who was covering it because he was a foreign correspondent, Jennings would say later that McKay did as good a job as any newsman ever had or could have. I think that it shows this merger, this bit about how we in the last one when I talked about the Heidi game, it was about how sports had become part of the popular culture and how it had become so important to TV. Here's the intersection of sports and politics in a most vivid way, where sports becomes news. And there are a lot of things that have happened since then where sports has wound up in the headlines for unsavory reasons or for non-sporting reasons. But this was an event in and of itself, and I think that for McKay's coverage on there alone, it deserves to be on a list, something like that. So I could not leave it off. I felt I just had to go that way.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a good one. So I guess that there's two that I would sort of put together, and they're not normally thought together, but I would consider the ongoing monthly, weekly coverage of first the Apollo moon landings and then secondly
Hmm.
Watergate,
Yep.
as we see. Because if we look at the Army McCarthy hearings, they were in a sense a one shot. Watergate was basically 2.5 years of nonstop coverage. Now we're used to this kind of stuff with Trump now, but if you go
Hmm.
back 50 plus years, this was something whole and novel, and so that's maybe the dark side there. Whereas the light side was the Apollo missions in general leading up to the moon landing. That was 5 6 years worth of coverage, and I think the relevance today is, for both of them, that is the Apollo landing. Think about how many yahoos now make videos about it's all fake and whatnot. They don't know the basic science, and it shows how far declined education is. And similarly, I was arguing with someone just a few weeks ago. I said, imagine if Gerald Ford, upon becoming president, had said, "Sorry, Dickie, you're going to jail." I think it would have set an example now, because Republicans then would stand up. They were most of them were willing to toss Nixon under the bus for
Hmm.
the love of country, the betterment of the country. And the very fact that Gerald Ford, a guy who wasn't even elected vice president, much less president, came and undercut that, to me, yes, Ford was a placeholder basically and whatnot, but he's got a certain place in infamy just because of that act.
I think you're right. And I think my next item ties in very nicely with that because the next significant event that I'm looking at is the creation of CNN
Mm.
going on the air. Because when CNN comes on the air, it changes the way we consume news and it changes the way we look at news. Uh, so we're up to June 1st, 1980 at this point. We've entered the decade of the 80s. And what what we've done is good and it's bad. And it's kind of like Newton Minow said once about television that when television is good, when it's very good, there's nothing better. The plays, movies, anything, nothing is better than television when it's good. When it's bad, nothing is worse. And this is the best and the worst of television right here. The idea of an all news network where you could tune in at any time of the day and not only get headlines, get the news, but it would be a network that would cover live news events that wouldn't ordinarily be seen on TV until the news. So, you know, I think that Ted Turner's explanation for the significance of CNN, if I had to pick one example that he gave, I think the example is the Reagan assassination attempt. Now, all of the networks covered that. And for anybody who doesn't remember the circumstances about that, Reagan was giving a speech in a hotel in Washington. As he was exiting the hotel, he was shot. That's where the coverage begins. And all the networks are covering it. But Turner would later say only CNN covered the speech. So that was the point, is that wherever the news was happening, CNN was there. And that was absolutely revolutionary. Um, the downside of that is MSNBC, Fox News, what CNN has become today, and the idea that it has become apparent, I think, that in your day-to-day life, news is not a 24/7 proposition. News can happen at any time, but that doesn't guarantee that it will happen. And if you have a slow news day, then you've got to find something worth broadcasting. And so you have things that I think are significant moments in television that are an outgrowth of the creation of CNN. You have the O.J. Simpson trial. You have so many of the other political things that are covered on an hourly basis, on a very minute basis. You have stories that would have become big that now become dominating. And you have stories that would have been dominating that become overwhelming. And you're able to turn a lost child into a major event. Now, every murder practically, and I'm exaggerating, I realize that, but practically every murder and every murder trial seems to be a cause celeb. There is nothing insignificant. Every car chase, every wanted fugitive becomes a national story. I think this is bad for a variety of reasons, but I think it is particularly bad because it has cheapened the news. It's ruined the concept of a bulletin. I mean, breaking news is just what your next story is going to be. So I think that the promise that CNN had when it came on the air, which was enormous, has for a variety of reasons petered out. Perhaps the best thing that CNN could have done was go to the headline news format overnight, or have particular shows that, as they used to, that were devoted to foreign news or entertainment news or sports or different things where it could have evolved like different sections of a newspaper, rather than having shout shows, chat shows, sitcom type things, documentaries that aren't documentaries, all sorts of things that have multiplied like a virus to cover out what's the number of hours that they need to do. All of that, good and bad, is because of CNN. So that has to be a significant moment in TV history.
Well, I'll follow up on your promises made and promises not kept theme there. And I'm going to go back a couple of years to the airing of Roots, the original Roots, the miniseries. And we talked about miniseries before. But this was, before that, there had only been a handful of miniseries. Most of them, even the big blockbusters before Roots, which weren't as big but were still significant, like Rich Man, Poor Man, were basically glorified soap operas. And yes, Alex Haley was eventually shown to have been guilty of picking and plagiarizing a few things from a handful of other people's work, and that diminishes his reputation. But nothing can diminish the reputation of the show that put black actors in the spotlight, put black history in the spotlight, and showed that this could be dramatic, it could hold the attention of the nation, and so forth. And then we went back to just, again, soap operas and the like, and the miniseries format faded. Black television became nothing but sitcoms again. Who is the kid? Urkel became the new J.J. Walker, Jimmy J.J. Walker kind of character. And there's not been any serious black. There's never been a black version of the Waltons. There's never been a black version of Mad Men. Yes, I know there have been a few shows like but it's typical Hollywood fodder.
Yeah.
So here we have the promise that now we're gonna deal with black Americans as normal people who have a history, who have trials and tribulations that aren't soap operatic. And after that big splash, you got a couple of follow-ups, the inevitable Christmas Story or something, and that's it.
Well, you remember that the subtitle of Roots was The Story of an American Family.
Mm.
And I think that sums it up perfectly, that that was a seminal moment in TV history. You talk again about what a ratings sensation it was. And I lived in a town that back when I was going to high school that did not have an ABC affiliate. So we didn't get Roots. But it was of such importance that teachers were getting videotapes of it and showing it in their classrooms the next day or a couple of days later. And so it was kind of through this combination of osmosis in reading the news headlines and actually getting to see it a couple of days later, you became aware of this groundswell that was going on, this sensation that was happening. And I agree with you, not only what you say about Roots, but I wish that that had been not only for the promise that it held for for black entertainers, black actors, and just those kinds of stories in general, which are culturally significant stories, and they are significant to our American heritage. But the promise of the miniseries itself as the prestige form of television that we now see on cable and streaming, and with the advent of the limited series, which is more than a mini series but less than a regular series, I think that the potential that the miniseries had was huge, and the potential that Roots as a cultural institution had was huge. And in both ways, it seems to have kind of fallen short. But it's very significant. You're right.
So what's number 8 for you?
Okay, number 8, and if I were doing this again with our conversation, I might have lumped this in with number 7. But I think that I've got kind of like an 8A and an 8B. 8A is the formation of ESPN, which occurred late in 1979, and which changed the way we consume sports in the same way that CNN changed the way we consume news. So if you just substitute ESPN for CNN, you've pretty much got my feelings on how ESPN changed news. But the more significant, I think, in a way, the more significant event I look at is July 13th, 1985, and that's Live Aid. And I think Live Aid was a tremendously important moment in television for a couple of reasons. One, because it was an event that attracted a worldwide audience that ran for almost an entire day, and that showed entertainers in the very best possible light that they could. You know, I think, for example, of Woodstock as kind of a glorified weekend of Sodom and Gomorrah, that there was great entertainment involved, but that it was that it was a harbinger of some really grim cultural times in this country. Live Aid was just the opposite of that. It was this huge benefit to try to ease the famine in Africa through raising awareness and money. It had most of all the biggest acts in the world. It was on from roughly 8 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night, because it was taking place both in England and in the United States. And it gave credibility to MTV. Before that, MTV was a network that ran videos, period. And Live Aid was the first event of its kind that MTV covered that really gave it credibility as a go-to source for what was going on. You know, today an event like this would either be on cable, or it would be on a network, or it would be on some combination thereof. But in the United States, and people don't remember this, in the United States, if you didn't have cable television in 1985, there was only one way to see Live Aid, and it was on a syndicated feed that did not show the concert in its entirety. It ended, I think, at 5 o'clock Central Time, and then ABC picked up the coverage at 7 o'clock. So the syndicated feed ended around the time that local news began. The only way you could see all of Live Aid from beginning to end was to watch it on MTV. So Live Aid was an important cultural event. It was an important news event, and it was probably the single event that gave credibility to MTV, that made even bigger stars out of its announcers, its VJs, you know, who could Who can forget seeing Martha Quinn or Mark Goodman there in London or Philadelphia covering it? So that I think is a hugely significant event, not only culturally but in terms of television history. And I think that ultimately it falls into the same category as CNN and ESPN in that it failed to fulfill its potential. MTV is a disaster now. Nobody watches it. All they have are these horrible reality type shows. There are ways to watch videos without watching MTV because they don't show them anymore. So the video form of entertainment and music publicity has not gone away, but it's certainly changed. MTV has changed. And whether or not the network could ever have sustained the promise that it had in the mid 80s, where I just flip it on and watch it for hours because you could. And you can't do that anymore. And I don't know why the network even continues to exist.
Yeah.
So I think that like the others, this is another example of potential that has kind of gone away. And maybe it's significant for that reason as well, because it shows the graveyard of unfulfilled potential that TV history is often consists of.
Well, I would go in the same vein of networks coming out of the ether. I'd have to go with the Fox network, the rise of Fox in the late 80s. Whatever you want to say about Rupert Murdoch, and there's a lot to say about him, without a doubt, the last 30, well, close to 40 years now, without the Fox network, it's a different country, not only politically, but Fox Sports became the leading sports network. Once it got that NFL contract, boom, The Simpsons, they'll be around, when we're bombed back into the Stone Age.
Yep.
And then even its few successes artistically, like I think Married with Children. My wife was telling me the other day that she saw a few episodes of Married with Children, and then she had seen a few with Family Ties, and she said Married with Children was so far superior a show just in terms of writing, acting, and also in terms of its critique of American culture. So, and the very fact that it ended the 30-year 3-network stranglehold, it has to be, I think, on a list like this.
And I think, you could include the Tracy Ullman show in that as well, which of course is where The Simpsons actually started. But even leaving The Simpsons out of Tracy Ullman, that was an extremely creative series. It kind of broke the mold for what a sitcom / variety show / entertainment show could be. And so it was very progressive, very creative for the time, and that kind of ties in to what Fox could have become, what television could have become, this conduit for experiments, for experimental programming that the pioneers of television had always thought TV would and could become and never did. And I think that's an example.
I think that you and I, if people look at these shows in 50 or 60 years, are going to say, "Oh, there's those two old grumpy guys who thought everything went to pot after 1980." But I think we both sort of agree that television has gotten worse, generally speaking, with few exceptions. So, what's number 9 for you?
Number 9. It would seem to be kind of a gimme. It's 9/11. And the reason I put it on the list, though, is because it was a global event. It was not only breaking news, and you could say the same for the Kennedy assassination, but 9/11 was a global event. Everybody experienced it at the same time. And one of the things that the Kennedy assassination couldn't do was cover remotely a lot of the things that happened. The assassination itself was not on TV. The Oswald murder kind of accidentally got on TV, and it was only live on one of the networks. But 9/11, after that initial hit, you saw everything. You saw the second plane crash. You saw the fire at the Pentagon. You heard them reporting almost as it happened about what was going on in Pennsylvania. You heard all these horror stories, one after the other, until you literally could not imagine what was going to happen next. Was it going to be the Capitol? Was it going to be the White House? Is it only in this country, or is it going to be worldwide? What's going to happen next? And, we forget that on 9/10, there were no news crawls on any of the stations. That was not a part of news. But when 9/11 came along, so much was happening so quickly that they had not only one, but two crawls with different information streams going on. They couldn't keep up with it. And so I think that 9/11 is significant in that sense, that it was perhaps the epitome of a worldwide event being covered as it happened. And I just couldn't think of anything comparable to it that would have had the impact and that would have impacted almost everyone in the world at the same time the way it did.
Yeah, and I think in a much lesser degree, what spawned from it a year or two, a few years later, was the I think it was aired live in the morning, was when George W. Bush was on the big boat there with the mission accomplished sign, and
Yes.
you still had pushback from the last of the Cronkite people or types who would say, yeah, but this wasn't the mission. There were no WMDs there. This was a lot, and it presages so much of now. What, 20 some years later, we deal with Trump. So anyway, I would say in a similar vein, I would pair the Challenger and Columbia disasters, and obviously they're both space shuttles. They both, a minute or two after taking off, exploded. But I think the significance isn't really so much the disasters as how they were perceived. The first one, the Challenger in '86, we're still closer in time to JFK. We're still closer in time to Watergate. There's still a sense of deep mourning, coming together as a one people. When I look back, and I noted it then, and I think now it's even more important, Columbia was a year and a half or so after 9/11, I believe, 2 years maybe. And so it's the post 9/11 world. We are now in the 24/7 news cycle. And it just didn't hit as the way it did. Maybe it would have hit more hard had it not been a 9/11. But there was more of a collective shrug. And in just 17, 18 years difference, was it? I think 86 and '03.
Yes.
I think that the way it was reported, the way it affected the nation, it wasn't one of those things where children were crying. I remember in the Challenger, there was the teacher, Krista McAuliffe. Kids were watching at school. 17 years go by. We've got the internet too. We got much more information coming even more quickly. But it's like, this was the beginning, I think, of the turning off of the American public to substance. And I think these two things, separated by 17 years, with 9/11 there being the post or the pre and the post 9/11 world, I think both the reactions of those two are very significant. And I think historically, they are forever entwined, even with 9/11 in between them.
Well, it's funny you mention that because, and this probably gives more of an insight into my psychological profile than I would like to admit, but when I have downtime, I often will just pop my headset on and watch old news broadcasts on YouTube, whether they are regular news broadcasts or bulletin breaking news type things. And so I've seen a good chunk of the TV coverage as it happened of both of the shuttle disasters, and you're right. There's no comparison in the two of them. I find both of them gripping, and the idea of seeing the shuttle break up in some of those films that they have is certainly shocking. As shocking as seeing the previous shuttle exploding, but You're right. We've transitioned into a 24/7 news cycle, and what we're seeing is the same stuff repeated over and over and over again because there isn't enough new information being generated, and you didn't have children breaking down. You didn't have the Metropolitan Opera canceling its Saturday afternoon broadcast because it was on a Saturday that this happened. You didn't have everything come to a complete halt. You had people take notice of it. And I think that that's a subtle change, a subtle difference, but it is a difference in how we consumed and how we reacted to stories happening. So I agree with your assessment on that.
So what's number 10 for you?
Number 10 is, I'll be brief about this because we're actually still experiencing it. And number 10 is not a singular event. It's the one exception I kind of made to this, but it is the advent of streaming, of social media, consumption of television shows, and in general of the on-demand phenomenon of television. And what this has done is, with the exception of breaking news and sports, it has ended the concept of television as a communal experience where we all watch the same show at the same time. It's a nail in the coffin of cable TV. Is it the final nail? We don't know yet. But it was a nail in that coffin. It was another nail in the coffin of over-the-air television because, again, people are able to catch even network shows on demand the next day or later in the week. They're able to binge watch an entire series over the course of a weekend. It has changed not only the way we consume television, the way we consume entertainment, but it's also changed the way that networks and corporations look at their programming, because now a show that would have been canceled in 3 or 4 weeks back in the 60s is a major hit because you have a lower viewing audience. You also have a lower standard of what constitutes success. It isn't only the numbers, but it is how many subscribers a show can add to your network. It is how much ad revenue it can generate. It is how it fills up your catalog of programming, and it gives you credibility as an alternative streaming outlet. So it's not about popularity at all in a way. It's about functionality, and it is very utilitarian in that sense. You look at Formula One as a sports example. Formula One is looking to double its media rights next year, and it's rightfully so because it's one of the most popular sports in the world. It can't get anybody to give it the kind of money that it's looking for. Formula One might have thought that Netflix would be a natural fit because Netflix has the very popular Drive to Survive show, which has helped make Formula One so popular. So why isn't Netflix interested in going for Formula One? It's because almost everyone who would subscribe to Netflix for Formula One already subscribes to Netflix. So it has no cash value for the company. And that's a major change as to how we look at that kind of thing. And I think that's it. It's not a single date. It's a state of being, and the reason that it comes as number 10 is because it's still going on, and we don't know where it's going to end.
Yeah, I was going to call it the death of the network television that
Mm-hmm.
we talked about before. So since you took that one, I'm going to go a little bit lighter because, as I've told you many times and said on the show, the last 20 or so years, I'm not as up on things. So I'm going to go back in time a little bit. And since you mentioned the Munich games in '72, I'm going to give a positive and not a negative, but a more sober pair of sporting events. The first one is, as a New Yorker, the 1977 World Series with Reggie Jackson hitting 3 home runs in the final game. And the reason I say so is that this was really and truly the birth of a sports athlete becoming something more than just a sports athlete. And you have to know that in 1977, New York had blackouts. It had budget overruns. It had crime infestation. It had a serial killer, David Berkowitz, stalking the thing. And what he did just on a purely athletic scale, Reggie Jackson hitting 3 home runs on 3 consecutive pitches, 4 if you go back to the prior game. This is like Michael Jordan having scored 150 points in a basketball game that won him a title, or it's as if Tom Brady had thrown for 500 yards in the Super Bowl in that 28-3 comeback or something. So there's that on sort of the just more personal level. But then I'd have to go to the 1989 World Series with the Bay Area and
Yes.
the earthquake. And this is a mixture of breaking news with sports like Munich, but it's also natural disaster. You're there to have fun, and then boom, highways start to fall, buildings get condemned. So I think the '77 series sees Reggie Jackson, who got a candy bar named after him after he made an offhanded flippant comment, "They'll name a candy bar after me." Without him, you don't get Michael Jordan and the super popularity. You don't get the Tom Brady's and now the Patrick Mahomeses. And with the '89, it's sort of, I guess, like if in ancient Rome, if Pompeii had blown up during the Olympic Games or something.
It was almost like Black Sunday come to life, except instead of a terrorist attack, it was a natural disaster, but it was the same kind of thing. Yeah. I think you mentioned that, we're a couple of old farts talking about the good old days and everything. And as you noted, my list tended to be heavy toward the earlier part of television history rather than the more current part. But I'm reminded of something that Abraham Lincoln said when he became president, that he had a concern that the time for making a difference in this country, of helping to shape the country, was over. That Washington and the founding fathers had been the men to create the country, and that there was no more room for greatness to shape a destiny of a nation. Now, he readily acknowledged that he was wrong as the time went on, and he plays this huge role in the Civil War, of course, and that has had enormous repercussions through the decades. But the point is that everyone at a certain time looks at history as being back-ended, that eventually you see, if not, what Francis Fukuyama called the end of history. If you don't see the end of history, you at least see a diminishment in the opportunities to be able to create or participate in events that make a pivotal difference in what happens in the world. And so I think, of necessity, you are always going to have lists like this that are dominated by the past, if you're looking at it from a sensible historical perspective, and not because you're suffering from recency bias like most so-called TV experts do today. And I think that in 50 or 60 years' time, there may be things that we can't comprehend of, or things that we didn't pay much attention to that would wind up on somebody else's list for precisely that reason. But by definition, I think that's how television history, or any kind of history, is going to happen.
Yeah, and you have to have some distance, because some things that you think are great or significant turn out not to be as significant.
Right.
I remember at the turn of this century, remember in 98, 99, 2000, there was all this talk about who are the most influential people in history, and you had these lists compiled, many different lists. And and what shocked me as someone who likes history was there was no Genghis Khan here in the last 1,000 years. And I was like, well, to me, the significance is, if you pluck this person out of history, where do the marbles fall and change more? And to me, Genghis Khan wasn't included. People like Albert Einstein was, and Shakespeare and whatnot. But Genghis Khan wasn't included because he wasn't white and European, and he was also a pretty bad guy. But he, by coming early in the 12th and 13th centuries, by definition, he's going to, in a sense, have more, because he's going to have had centuries more time to have his influence rippled out. The man, something like 12, 15% of people in Asia have Genghis Khan's DNA in him because of the
Yeah.
rampaging Mongols and his children and whatnot. Even though he was a mass murderer and arguably committed the first planned genocide, I won't go into all the details, but he also was for religious freedom. He also had one of the first working post offices that was more than 1,000 miles long. So there were positive things too. But that brings me to, as we close here, in looking at just a few of these lists, just as we were talking and beforehand, there seem to be a lot of lists that have really bad examples or things that they put forth. So let me ask you, and then I'll go. In compiling your list, did you find one or two things that were just silly things that people listed as most important, and what were they?
Yeah, I think perhaps not a specific program, but a genre of programs. I mean, you see a lot of people talking about the advent of reality television. So they might list Survivor, they might list Dancing with the Stars as significant moments. Well, if you're going to take the Genghis Khan route and talk about something like reality TV, then really what you need to do is go all the way back to An American Family, talking about the Louds. And on PBS, that was the first reality TV show.
Yeah.
So I think this whole idea of this recency bias, and you'll have people including Oprah's interview with Tom Cruise, or whomever you might have had her interview with some of the royals, or whomever might have been on Ellen DeGeneres' show that was brought to tears or brought her to tears. Yeah. The incredibly insignificant things, not only because in the long run they aren't historically significant, but because they're terribly unsubstantive. Yeah. And they're so shallow. And perhaps that's why they're significant, because they say a little bit about how shallow we've become as a society and a culture. But appalling. Yeah. That's the only word.
And two that stuck out to me that I saw on a few lists mentioning the royals was the death of Princess Diana. Now, nothing against the woman. She was, I guess, good or bad, but she's from another country. She had no real political power. She was the epitome of someone who was, if not born, married into position. Mm-hmm. And, it's bad that it's sad that she and her lover died being chased by paparazzi, but the coverage given to it, or more recently to I guess Meghan Markle and whatnot, is just ridiculous and shows the puerility of our society.
You could not to interrupt you just for a second though. You could throw the death of JFK Jr. into that too. Yeah, that's the same kind of a story.
Yeah, and the other one was listed was the 2008 election speech by Obama when he became president. And I remember thinking, as reading that, this is good. The country is in the process of breaking off its own self-imposed shackles of bigotry and whatnot. But looking back on it, you look back on the speech, hope. You're the goddamn president. Enact.
Yes,
Stop with the hope. And to me, certainly of all the presidents, I don't think there's been a good president in my lifetime, and Obama would probably be in the top 2 or 3. But I think he's an utter mediocrity, and that people look at this as if he was giving the Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech with presidential power is utterly absurd.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't the Cross of Gold speech, that's for sure. I enjoyed this a lot because we didn't have a lot of overlap, although we did have a lot of complementary things. And what that means, I think, among other things, is number one, 10 great items, 10 significant events in TV history isn't enough, because TV has a big history. That's part of what my new book is about, and we'll talk about that at another time. But it's the idea that TV has a big history, and that TV itself has done a terrible job of promoting and preserving that history. But it's also that there's so much to it. There's live television, there's episodic television, there's sports, there's news. all of these things that are combined, and you could make up so many lists that that are not bad, that are filled with great stuff, and you wouldn't have many duplications because it's a rich history, and it is for people like us. It's great fun to go through it all.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna finish out the decades probably in the next 8 to 10 months, and we've got there's lots of different profiles of people we can do and so forth. But I think doing 2 or 3 of these shows where we're a little less planned and a little more off the cuff and just circling around a particular topic is something that is good. So I think maybe that's something we can do more often as well.
I enjoy it.
So that's it for this month, and we will be back next month with more, whatever comes to our mind.
Whatever it is, yeah.
All
Looking
right.
forward to it, Dan.
All right.